Hello everyone. In this video I will discuss one of the films called Tang and Me. And never forget that I always pray for you and your family to be happy and healthy always. An unemployed man obsessed with augmented reality games is kicked out of his house by his wife for refusing to look for a job. One day this man encounters a mysterious robot that gradually changes the course of his life. This is a brief synopsis of a film adapted from the novel A Robot in the Garden by Deborah Install. The story begins in a future city in Japan where robots and humans coexist. Ken Kasugai is an unemployed man who loves augmented reality games. One day his wife Emmy tells him about a strange robot that suddenly appeared in their backyard. Ken responds dismissively and tries to find other activities to avoid the conversation. However, when Emmy asks about his job interview, Ken flees to the yard to check the back gate, which seems damaged and could explain how the robot entered. The robot, mentioned by Emmy, is seen sitting under a tree, gazing at a group of horses in front of it. Ken approaches the robot and asks a few questions, but the robot oddly only repeats Ken's words before introducing itself as Tang. Ken immediately takes Tang to a junk shop to sell any valuable parts. However, the shop owner comments on the lack of a serial number on the robot, making it impossible to recycle. When Tang's body is opened, the two men are shocked to find a strange machine inside, marked with 8-bit system, the leading robot manufacturer. Ignoring the robot, Ken decides to return home, unaware that Tang is following him. Ken returns home and leaves the door open, allowing Tang to enter. Tang begins scanning all of Ken's family portraits before playing with a box of tissues in the living room. Meanwhile, Ken finds his wife, Emmy, standing in a room they plan to turn into a nursery someday. Emmy informs Ken that the hospital called, wondering why Ken didn't attend his job interview. This perplexes Emmy, especially since the hospital promised to make Ken a permanent employee if he showed up on time. Ken nonchalantly responds that he forgot about it. Emmy continues to demand an explanation from Ken until they reach the living room, where they notice Tang's presence. This escalates the argument, with Emmy desperately expressing her frustration about being the sole breadwinner while Ken lazes around. In a fit of anger, Emmy intentionally smashes an antique clock inherited from Ken's late father. This enrages Ken, who declares that he no longer cares, resulting in Emmy kicking him out of the house along with Tang. While sheltering at a bus stop and grumbling about his wife's behavior, Ken notices a leak in Tang's body. He opens Tang up and uses his sock to dry the leaking fluid. Growing curious about the 8-bit logo, Ken scans it with his phone, which leads him to the company's website offering a trade-in program for old robot models in exchange for the latest models. Noticing a chef robot that Emmy would love, Ken hatches a plan to trade Tang for the chef robot in hopes of mending his relationship with his wife. Thus, Ken and Tang set off for the 8-bit company located in Fukuoka. During the flight, Ken asks Tang to stay quiet so he can sleep. Tang activates the in-flight entertainment system and starts absorbing all the information, including character shapes and dialogue. Soon, Tang becomes engrossed in an anime show that states friendship is more important than wealth and appearances. Ken's sleep is interrupted by a child who throws food at his face. Annoyed, Ken mutters a rude comment, which Tang records and broadcasts loudly on repeat. When Ken scolds him, Tang gets upset and starts releasing steam, causing a commotion on the plane. Upon arriving at the 8-bit office, Ken is disappointed to find it closed for the day. Tang finds an old coin no longer in circulation, which he sees as a treasure and stores it under the duct tape on his body. Spending the night at a hotel, Ken considers calling Emmy but changes his mind, recalling her harsh words. He goes to make coffee and accidentally falls asleep while waiting for it to brew. In his sleep, Ken dreams about the last moments with his late father, but is abruptly awakened by the noise Tang makes after accidentally breaking the coffee pot. The next day, they return to the 8-bit office to exchange Tang for a newer model robot. However, the receptionist robot refuses Ken's request, claiming that Tang is not one of their creations. Meanwhile, A tour guide named Shinji is explaining the history of robots to a group of children. The children quickly become distracted by Tang, who they find adorable. Amid the crowd, Tang suddenly jumps to save a beetle from being trampled by the children. This act surprises Shinji and piques his curiosity, prompting him to ask Ken for permission to examine Tang. In his office, Shinji reveals that he is actually a robot designer at Atobit, but due to his good looks, he is sometimes asked to be a tour guide. During his examination of Tang, Shinji discovers a strange processor and a cracked tube containing a mysterious liquid. This liquid could be fuel, lubricant, or even a cooling gel. Shinji is certain that if the liquid runs out, Tang will cease to function. He temporarily repairs the cracked tube to prevent further leakage and advises Ken to find a replacement tube soon. Shinji is fascinated by Tang because the robot exhibits high levels of imagination and curiosity, traits he has never seen in any other robot's intelligence. He also notes that Tang was created with limited resources and has the potential for future upgrades. However, the key question remains: who made this robot and for what purpose? Shinji then shares information about Tang with his colleagues, which catches the attention of a robotics expert named Otsuki. Otsuki claims she might be able to fully repair Tang, but to meet her, Ken would have to travel to China. This suggestion initially makes Ken reluctant, as he sees Tang merely as a broken robot he found in his backyard. Avoiding further discussion, Ken takes Tang away under the pretense of wanting to buy coffee. On their way out from the Atobit office, they pass a festival that excites Tang, who wants to explore everything there. After understanding the concept of buying goods, Tang uses the coin he found to buy a cup of coffee, which he then gives to Ken. Although the coffee has mostly spilled by the time it reaches Ken, he appreciates Tang's effort and pretends to drink it. Touched by Tang's gesture, Ken decides to take Tang to China for repairs. Upon arriving in Shenzhen, where a vibrant fireworks display is taking place, Tang suddenly has a vision of robots shooting at humans. This frightens Tang, who then hides behind Ken. Meanwhile, back at Atobit, Shinji is visited by two mysterious men looking for Tang, and it doesn't take long for these men to also arrive in Shenzhen. The next day, Ken and Tang go to a robot museum, where they finally meet Otsuki, who is very excited about Tang's existence. However, while Ken and Otsuki are engrossed in conversation, they fail to notice Tang wandering away, following a remote-controlled toy. The toy leads Tang into a trap set by the two mysterious men from earlier. When Ken and Otsuki realize Tang is in a moving van, Otsuki quickly asks Ken to throw her ID card into the van so they can track its location. Using the GPS tracker in Otsuki's ID card, they chase after the van using a public bus. During the pursuit, Ken is puzzled as to why anyone would want to kidnap Tang, considering he is just a broken robot. Otsuki explains that Tang possesses human-like intelligence, which makes him valuable and a target for irresponsible individuals. Meanwhile, Emmy, worried about her husband's whereabouts, reminisces about how they first met. It is revealed that their first encounter happened when Ken accidentally caught a wine bottle cap that Emmy opened at a celebration party. Concerned for Ken, Emmy decides to contact him while he is on his mission to rescue Tang in a warehouse area. Hoping Ken will change, Emmy creates a scenario by saying she plans to leave him, believing her role in caring for him is over. She even tries to provoke Ken by suggesting they separate. Unexpectedly, Ken agrees, thinking it's the best choice for Emmy. This response causes Emmy to start crying. At the same time, a warehouse door suddenly opens, and Otsuki and Ken seize the opportunity to enter. As the two mysterious men leave, they approach Tang to try to free him from his cage. Just as they are about to leave, an old man named Dr. Kato appears along with the two mysterious men. Kato reveals that the microchip inside Tang was created by a roboticist named Professor Baba. Since Otsuki and Ken do not seem to understand the gravity of the situation, Kato orders his men to take Tang away. In response, Ken begins to insult Tang with harsh words, which makes Tang angry and start releasing steam. Ken uses this distraction to fight the mysterious men with a slingshot he finds nearby, while Otsuki grabs a stun gun and uses it to buy Ken time to escape with Tang. After running a considerable distance, Tang suddenly starts emitting smoke. Realizing something is wrong, Ken opens Tang and discovers that the fluid in the tank is nearly depleted. At that moment, Ken receives a call from a man who identifies himself as Professor Baba. During the conversation, Baba explains that Tang was originally a robot named James who survived an accident at a research facility. Baba expresses his gratitude and asks Ken to bring Tang to his home for repairs. Without suspicion, Ken takes Tang back to Japan and then travels to Miyakojima Island. Upon arrival, they board a tourist boat, and Tang is thrilled to admire the fish in the sea. When they reach the dock, Tang accidentally falls into the water, prompting Ken to dive in to save him. As they dry off on a beach, Tang tells Ken he wants to go home with him, but Ken refuses because he fears he can't manage Tang's worsening condition. Ken recalls how his father died because he couldn't decide which medicine his father usually took, and he blames himself for not being a good husband to Emmy. Hearing this, Tang reassures Ken that Emmy will always be there for him and tries to cheer him up by dancing and singing. Eventually, they arrive at Professor Baba's house. The professor welcomes them in and provides bioethanol to refuel Tang. Once recharged, Tang suddenly becomes scared and hides behind Ken, but the professor attributes this to the loss of his previous memories. Curious, Ken asks about the incident that happened to Tang, but before the professor can answer, Tang insists that Ken take him home. Unfortunately, feeling he has no right to decide, Ken leaves Tang with Professor Baba. Tang then asks Ken if they aren't friends, but Ken doesn't respond and walks away. Sometime later, after leaving the professor's house, Ken is suddenly approached by Kato, who frantically asks about Tang's whereabouts. This time, Kato apologizes for his previous behavior and introduces himself as a researcher who once worked for Professor Baba. 5 years ago, Professor Baba was involved in a secret project to develop artificial intelligence for military combat purposes. During a shooting drill one day, a robot named James suddenly exhibited human-like fear. Due to this human-like intelligence, Kato urged the professor to halt the tests. However, Professor Baba ignored Kato's request, leading to James going out of control and starting to shoot at other robots and several military personnel in the testing room. After this incident, Professor Baba stole the microchip from James's body before initiating a self-destruct procedure on the research facility. Since this was a secret project, the incident was covered up and labeled as an accident. Hearing this story, Ken takes Kato's car and rushes back to Professor Baba's house. Meanwhile, Tang does everything he can to escape from the professor. When Ken finally arrives, Tang quickly explains that Professor Baba desperately wants the microchip inside him. At the same time, the professor rushes to his computer to lock all the doors. Surveillance cameras reveal that Kato has also arrived and is searching for them. Then the professor displays all the recordings from Tang and thanks Ken for all the unique data he has taught Tang. He also reveals his desire to harness James's intelligence as the key to unlimited wealth. Before attacking Ken with a metal beam and attempting to remove the microchip from Tang's body, the professor expresses his intention. In the fight, Ken urges Tang to leave immediately, but before he can finish his sentence, the professor controls the robotic arm to attack Ken again. In the end, the fight concludes after Ken and Tang work together to defeat Professor Baba. Right after that, a steel cabinet suddenly collapses, hitting Tang's body. Ken tries to save him, but unfortunately, the robot does not respond at all, and the fuel tube cracks again. Therefore, Ken quickly replaces it with a new tube, but because there is no significant change, he contacts Kato to ask for his help in repairing Tang. There, Kato immediately realizes that there may be damage to the connecting cables, so he asks Ken to reconnect them. However, Ken struggles to determine which side to connect the cables, and unfortunately, Kato admits that only Professor Baba knows that information. If Ken mismatches the cables, it could cause a short circuit, resulting in Tang's system being completely damaged. This reminds Ken of his past trauma when he couldn't choose the right medicine, which led to his father's death. Therefore, recalling Tang's words that they will always be there for each other, Ken dares to randomly connect the cables, and surprisingly, Tang becomes active again. However, at that moment, the robot didn't wake up as Tang but as James, indicating that the robot had lost its memory. Despite Ken's disappointment, he patiently begins to tell the story of how they first met. Slowly, this prompts James to recount the events starting from when he escaped from Professor Bubba's house and saw a horse transport truck named Tanigawa. However, because the letters were starting to fade, the robot read it as Tang. Then he followed the truck, which brought him to the backyard of Ken's house. It was then that James, who remembered everything, returned to being Tang and made Ken cry with emotion. Shortly after, the authorities began to arrive to arrest Professor Bubba, while Kato approached Ken to explain that the microchip inside Tang's body still belonged to the research facility. Nevertheless, Ken was allowed to take Tang away as long as he agreed to be part of the team and report all valuable data to the facility. And finally, Ken also had to sign a contract with the approval of his family. With enthusiasm for the new life ahead, Ken then took Tang to go home immediately. There they met Emmy, who was ready to leave the house, along with the antique clock belonging to Ken's late father, which appeared to have been repaired by Emmy. Ken praised his wife for fixing the clock, but Emmy responded quite coldly, leaving Ken unable to say anything. Just as Emmy was about to leave, Tang immediately stopped her and played back a recording of Ken's voice just before they returned home, where Ken says they will go home so he can become a doctor, and one day he will tell Emmy that everything will be okay. This ultimately makes Emmy cry, and then cancels her intention to leave home after Ken promises to be a useful husband. And when Emmy thanks Tang for bringing her husband home, Tang detects another form of life inside Emmy's belly, revealing that Emmy is actually pregnant. Initially, Emmy thought to keep the pregnancy secret from her husband to raise the child alone, but after what happened today, Emmy is very confident that Ken will be a great father. The film ends with Tang happily dancing covered in cloth, and that's the story brought by the film adaptation of the novel A Robot in the Garden by Deborah Install. And that's it for the story series of this film. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to support this channel by subscribe, like and share. See you in the next video. Goodbye.